I want to concur with much of what my colleague from Vermont has just said. Clearly, in our small state, a government shutdown will be devastating for many thousands of federal employees. If a shutdown continues, it will be devastating for families who have kids in Head Start. If a shutdown continues, it will be devastating for seniors who are on the Meals on Wheels program, for pregnant women and young mothers and their kids who are on the WIC program. This is going to hit Vermont hard, and it's going to hit America hard, and this is something that should not be taking place. You know, Madam President, this debate is not about the Affordable Care Act. That is something that should be debated. I think it can be improved. What this debate is about is blackmail and hostage-taking. What my Republican colleagues, especially the right-wing extremists in the House, are upset about, it's not so much Obamacare. What they are upset about is they lost the election in November. President Obama won by some 5 million votes. They lost seats. The Republicans lost seats in the Senate. They lost some seats in the House. What they are upset about is they cannot legislatively accomplish what they want through the normal legislative process. What legislation is about is the House passes a bill, Senate passes a bill, they get together, work on something, compromise, President signs it. They don't have the support to do that. So what they have now concluded is that the only way they can go forward is to say, if we don't get our way, if we don't shut down the United States government and kill Obamacare or delay Obamacare, why, that's the only game in town. That's all that we're going to do. We can't do it the normal way. So what they are doing is holding the Congress and the American people hostage, and that is unacceptable. And it is unacceptable not only in terms of the Affordable Care Act. Let us be very clear. If we were to succumb and agree to this type of blackmail, does anybody not believe that 2 weeks from now, when the United States needs to pay its debts, that we will be threatened for the first time in the history of this country? We will be in a situation where we may not be able to pay our debts, which economists tell us could lead not only to a major financial and economic crisis in this country, but it can impact the entire world. So if we say, hey, no problem, we're going to yield to your blackmail now, what do you think happens in 2 weeks? They will be back again. And next year, when we go through this process again, it may not be the Affordable Care Act, it may be Social Security. Many of our right-wing extremist Republicans want to end Social Security. If we go through this process and submit to this blackmail now, I certainly will not be surprised if a year from now this same group of people says, look, you're not going to have a budget unless we end Social Security or we end Medicare as we know it right now. So submitting and allowing blackmail to take place, I think, is very bad public policy. If Republicans or anybody else wants to have a discussion about how we can improve the Affordable Care Act, and I certainly think that we can. I think it's too complicated in many respects. I think it leaves many people still uninsured. We are the only country in the industrialized world that does not provide health care to all of our people as a right, and Obamacare doesn't do that. So I want to see some improvements. Federal workers, we're going to impact many, many vulnerable people who are dependent on federal programs. There's another point that I would like to make, Madam President, is that we hear from some of our Republican colleagues that the world is about to come to an end because the Affordable Care Act will be implemented. The world's going to come to an end. But it is important to understand that many of these same arguments have been made in the past around the time or shortly after major pieces of legislation were passed, which today are enormously popular. Right now, we have over 50 million people who benefit from Social Security. Social Security is an enormously important and popular program in this country. But let me take you, Madam President, back to April of 1935, when Social Security was just passed. And let me quote what some of, turns out, Republicans had to say about Social Security at that time. On April 19th, 1935, Republican Congressman John Tabor said this about Social Security, and I quote, "Never in the history of the world has any measure been brought here so insidiously designed as to prevent business recovery, to enslave workers." To enslave workers was his language, and to prevent any possibility of the employers providing work for the people. Well, you go out and you ask most working people in Hawaii and in Vermont whether Social Security is, quote unquote, enslaving them, I think they would not understand what you are talking about. Because, in fact, since its inception, Social Security has been enormously successful in reducing the poverty rate among seniors. But it's not only Congressman Tabor in 1935. Here's what Republican Congressman James Wadsworth told the American people. He said that Social Security, quote, opens the door and invites the entrance into the political field of a power so vast, so powerful, and to threaten the integrity of our institutions and to pull the pillars of the temple down upon the heads of our descendants. Whoa, end of quote. World is just about coming to an end in 1935 because they passed Social Security. Republican Senator Daniel Hastings in 1935 called Social Security un-American and told the American people that Social Security would, quote, end the progress of a great country and bring its people to the level of the average European, end of quote. Not quite sure what that means, but looks pretty scary. On May 6, 1935, former Republican President Herbert Hoover, former President of the United States, said this about Social Security, and I quote, as a matter of economic security alone, we can find it in our jails. The slaves had it. Our people are not ready to be turned into a national zoo. Our citizens classified, labeled, and directed by a form of self-approved keepers, end of quote. That is a former President of the United States on Social Security. Madam President, it's not widely known, to be honest with you, I didn't know it, but in 1936, the Republicans campaigned to repeal Social Security. That year, the Republican nominee for president, Alf Landon, said that Social Security, quote, is unjust, unworkable, stupidly drafted, and wastefully financed, end quote. He called Social Security, quote, a fraud on the working man and a cruel hoax, and said we must repeal Social Security. The Republican Party is pledged to do this, end of quote. Alf Landon, Republican candidate for president. Well, it turned out not quite to be the case. Turned out that Social Security will probably go down in history as maybe the most important and successful program ever passed by the United States Congress, plays an enormous role in keeping seniors out of poverty, helps people with disabilities, helps widows and orphans. It has been enormously successful and enormously popular, despite all of these cries about how it was going to destroy our nation. Maybe we should learn something from these prophets of doom. Furthermore, you have a similar situation with regarding Medicare. In a fairly dysfunctional health care system, which we currently have today, where so many people are uninsured, so many people have high copayments, so many people have high deductibles, and yet we end up spending almost twice as much per capita on health care as do the people of other industrialized nations, which guarantee health care to all of their people. Congress passed in 1965 Medicare. And Medicare today is a very, very popular program. And today, nearly all seniors, about 50 million of them, are receiving guaranteed health care benefits through Medicare. But when Medicare legislation was being debated in 1965, this is what the Republicans, or some of the Republicans in Washington, had to say. Remember, today, Medicare is quite a popular program, generally regarded as a successful health care program for seniors. On April 8, 1965, Republican Congressman Durrett Hall had this to say about Medicare, quote, "We cannot stand idly by now as the nation is urged to embark on an ill-conceived adventure in government medicine, the end of which no one can see and from which the patient is certain to be the ultimate sufferer." Well, I don't know where Mr. Hall is today, but I think if he were to ask the seniors throughout this country whether they are suffering from Medicare or whether they approve of Medicare, I think most of them would say that they approve of Medicare. In terms of the Medicare debate that we had on July 8, 1965, Republican Senator Millward Simpson said this about Medicare, and I quote, "This program could destroy private initiative for our aged to protect themselves with insurance against the cost of illness. Presently, over 60% of our older citizens purchase hospital and medical insurance without government assistance. This private effort would cease if government benefits were given to all older citizens." 1965, Congressman Joel Broyhill wrote, quote, "Medicare would initiate what would ultimately become a federal monopoly in regard to the financing and rendering of health care with respect to our aged, to the detriment of endeavors of the private sector. This would impair the quality of health care, retard the advancement of medical science, and displace private insurance." And in 1961, Ronald Reagan warned that, quote, "Medicare will usher in federal programs that will invade every area of freedom as we have known it in this country. If you don't speak out against Medicare, one of these days you and I are going to spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was like in America when men were free," end of quote, Ronald Reagan. And on it goes. So the point to be made is not that the Affordable Care Act does not have its share of problems. It does. And not that it will take some work to implement it. It will. But what we have heard from Republicans in the past, whenever a major government initiative was introduced, was constant doomsday discussion about how the world would collapse. So let me just conclude by getting back, though, to my major point. And that is, in fact, this debate really is not about the Affordable Care Act. We can argue about the Affordable Care Act. We can change the Affordable Care Act. All of that is certainly legitimate. What this debate is about is whether 20 or 30 members, extreme right-wing members of the House of Representatives, are able to hold our entire government hostage. Hundreds of thousands of federal workers, many of whom are trying to bring up their families, are going to lose their paychecks, lose their jobs. People who are going to be applying for Social Security, they're going to be applying for Medicare, they're going to be applying for veterans benefits, will have that process significantly slowed down, depending on how long this shutdown continues. If it takes place, and I certainly hope it doesn't, it will mean that Head Start centers will be closing and other important programs will not be available to the people who need them. So once again, what this is not a discussion about the Affordable Care Act. What this is whether or not a small number of members of the House are able to use their position to blackmail the American people and the President and the Senate and say that if you do not do what we could not accomplish, what they could not accomplish legislatively, we're going to render terrible harm to our country. And furthermore, Madam President, as you well know, as bad as the government shutdown may be, and I certainly hope that does not take place, what we are looking at in 2 weeks is something that may be even worse. And if some of these guys get their way for the first time in the history of the United States of America, we, the largest economy on earth, may not pay our bills. And that will certainly cause a huge eruption, not only in our country, but throughout the world in terms of markets, raising interest rates and doing all kinds of terrible things. But once again, their understanding of government is, well, I guess it's too bad we lost the election for the White House, we lost seats in the Senate, we lost seats in the House. That's all too bad. But we still are going to do what we want to do, regardless of what the election is about. And we cannot allow that to happen, because if we do, it's not going to stop now. It will continue and continue and continue. So my hope is, frankly, that Speaker Boehner do something that he should do. You know, as Speaker, he is not the Speaker of the Republican Party. He is the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. And if he put, I suspect very strongly, that if he put the bill that we passed on the floor of the U.S. House, he would have virtually all Democrats and a number of Republicans voting for it, and a majority would say, we are not going to shut down the United States government. So my request to Speaker Boehner is let the people in his body, all of the people, not just Republicans, let them vote on what we passed here. And if he does that, I suspect we will not see a government shutdown, and you'll have some common sense over there. So, Madam President, with that, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk.